To understand the significance of the rise of China, I think perhaps it ought to be set in a broader context, which is the rise of the developing world more generally. Around about 1973, the developing world accounted for roughly a third of global GDP, and today it's something around 50-50. And according to the kind of projections produced by Goldman Sachs, this picture will steadily change along those lines to a point where, for example, I mean, this is obviously a distant historic projection, but in 2050, Chinese economy would be twice the size of the American economy, the Indian economy would be the same size as the American economy, and the next economies up would be countries like Mexico and Brazil and Russia and Indonesia. In other words, a very, very different world from the European and then Western world that we've grown up in the last 200 years. Now, obviously, this represents an extraordinary shift in the economic center of gravity. The question is, to what extent does it represent something more than that? Now, historically, modernity was more or less synonymous with Western modernity. The only exception was Japan, the only country to industrialize outside the West during the course of the 19th century. And the assumption was basically for a long time that the process of modernization was a process of westernization. Actually, if we'd taken Japan seriously enough, we would have seen that this was fallacious, because Japanese modernity has never looked like Western modernity. Obviously, like all modernities, it had to draw and learn from the West, but it developed a hybrid phenomenon, which in many respects looked profoundly different from what we were familiar with Western modernity. And if this is true of Japan, it certainly will be true of China. Highly distinct history, culture, and of course an additional factor which will mean that China will exercise a profound influence on the world, namely its sheer size means that it will have an extraordinary gravitational influence on the rest of the world. Now, what I want to spend a few minutes doing in the course of opening the seminar is to look at 4 characteristics of China which mark it out as very distinct from the Western experience, and in my view will also profoundly shape the nature of Chinese modernity in a very distinctive fashion. And as China becomes an increasingly important global power, and probably ultimately the leading global power, then these characteristics will come to also have a profound impact on the world more widely. Now, the first point I want to make, probably the most important for me, is that although China for 100 years has described itself as a nation state and adopted the protocol, norms and institutions of a nation state, it's not really a nation state. It's, or at least I like to think of China as the top soil is that of a nation state, but the geological structure of China is that of a civilization state. Now, what do I mean by this, or how can I call it? Why do I call it a civilization state? Well, as you know, very unusually, or uniquely, really, especially for such a large country, China has existed for a lot longer than 100 years. It's, I mean, if you take it back to the victory of the Qin at the end of the Warring State period, you're well over 2 millennium. And by then, China had begun to assume in the eastern part of China, the western part of China being much later as a result of the Qing dynasty's conquests and so on. In the eastern part of China, already the Qin boundaries were beginning to assume the character of the borders of China today. And if you look at the Han dynasty, which immediately succeeded it, then it's very clear that that is the case. And so China is at least, 2,000 years, of course the Chinese call themselves 5,000 years old, but at least 2,000 years old, the oldest continuously existing polity in the world. And what is so interesting about this, I think, is that all the characteristics which defined the Chinese as Chinese, which give the Chinese a sense of identity, come from the civilization state period, not from this very recent nation state period. Ideographic language, Confucian values, very distinctive character of the family, a very markedly different notion of the relationship between state and society. A lot of the Chinese customs like ancestral worship and so on come from this period. Unlike the tradition in the West, where essentially the sense of identity comes from the nation-state period. So this far history, I think, is extremely important in understanding China as a civilization state. The other dimension is the sheer scale, both demographic and physical, of China, and the diversity that comes from that. I mean, historically, I think, or contemporarily, we underestimate the diversity of China, probably for political reasons. And there are huge systemic variations across China, as well as enormous disparities between the provinces in terms of income per head, socioeconomic structure, and so on. Now, what does it mean in practice to be a civilization state? How does it affect behavior? Well, there's two things I want to say. There's lots of things we're going to say, but two examples. The first example is that actually the overriding political priority in the governance of China in the imperial period and in the communist period has been the problem of unity, the question of unity. This is the most important question, and this defines it. But the whole way the political dynamic works, it therefore distinguishes it from a Western tradition in this sense. And the reason why is because China's grown up with these enormous civilization extent, and this sense of history, but also it's extremely difficult to keep together. And for Wang Gungwu estimates that for the 2,000 years since the Qin, roughly half that time, China's been in various degrees of disunity and instability and so on, and generally coinciding with the worst periods of Chinese history. So firstly, unity is very important. If you want to know why I think Mao Zedong is still so popular in China to this day, Mao's greatest achievement, bar none, was that he put the country together again in 1949. He restored the country's sovereignty, and he also constructed an efficacious state, which has always been very important at the heart of China once more. So firstly, unity. And this is so different from Europe as to be extraordinary. I mean, the main difference between Europe and China is nothing to do with timing of industrialization, important as that is, or forms of governance and so, types of political system and so on. The fundamental difference was China unified, Europe divided, almost very similar historical period. Steady state, equilibrium position of Europe, nation state, divisions of nation states, equilibrium position of China is a civilization state. But the other point, in a way, the second example I want to give of this is more interesting, I think. And we didn't think of it in these terms at the time. But you remember in 1997 the handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China. And the Chinese constitutional proposal was one country, two systems, and I doubt whether anyone, or very, very few people, took the Chinese seriously. I think they probably thought, oh, a bit of window dressing, and you know, once the handover takes place, Hong Kong will be the same as it'll be incorporated on the terms of the PRC, whatever exactly those were. Actually, this was utterly mistaken. I mean, we're 12 years on from the handover, and the political and legal system of Hong Kong is as different now in fundamental respects as it was then. In other words, actually, when the Chinese proposed one country, two systems, they were completely serious about it. So why didn't we understand? Why didn't we see it like that? Why didn't we take them seriously? Well, I think the reason we didn't take them seriously is because it was a completely alien way of thinking to a Western mindset, which is used to handling nation states. So, for example, when Germany, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall, implosion of East Germany, reunification of Germany, was totally and exclusively on the terms of the Federal Republic. One nation, one system. This is classic nation-state thinking. One nation, state, one one system.